So I've been asked today to give a brief overview of the health and humanitarian situation in Ukraine today to set the stage for more in-depth discussions about the most significant geopolitical crisis to hit Europe in the last couple decades. So to be sure, the war in Ukraine started over 9 years ago with the Russian occupation of Crimea and the subsequent separatist movements in Donetsk and Lugansk. The full-scale Russian military invasion of Ukraine 14 months ago has resulted in a humanitarian crisis of massive proportions. The most obvious measure of the scale of the crisis may be in the number of people forcibly displaced from their homes. I'll just repeat a couple of the numbers that EJ put forward. In just the first half of last year, this became the largest refugee crisis of the 21st century, with over 8 million Ukrainians fleeing the country for refuge in Europe and beyond. On top of that, there are an additional 5 million Ukrainians who have fled the conflict zones to safer locations within the country. We often refer to these as internally displaced persons or IDPs. Now, UNHCR, we talked about the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, frequently tells us that fleeing one's home is generally, it's a last act of desperation that results in a complete break from a family's community support networks and dramatically heightens measures of vulnerability. Now, in the context of the Ukraine mass exodus, this was further complicated by the imposition of martial law that prevented most Ukrainian men from accompanying their families to safety. This has split up families and has created a tremendous burden on Ukrainian women who are caring for their children, their elderly, and their friends and family members living with disabilities. So my first trip into Ukraine following the invasion last year was in early March. It was about a week after the invasion. In fact, I was accompanied by my man Vlatko over there, and if you buy him a beer, he'll tell you a very surreal story of a heart transplant that we were witness to. But that's there may not be time for that one right now. But you know what we were talking about it earlier today, what we really remembered from that trip. Firstly, the return back to Poland. It was bitter cold. We were at the border for the better part of the day. We were surrounded by countless Ukrainian families. They were saying goodbyes to their husbands, brothers, and sons who were seeing them off. It was heartbreaking to witness. But the one thing that continues to stay with me was my conversation with the fellow Ukrainian travelers and this constant question over and over again: what are we going to do? What am I going to do? And the fear and apprehension of an uncertain future pervaded all the discourse that day. And today, 14 months on, it's still the essential question that they're facing. But even as we consider the magnitude of 13 million people displaced from their homes, we cannot overlook the conditions of those who have remained behind. Along the front lines of the war, those who have stayed are often forced to do so out of necessity, whether due to age, disability, or in caretaker roles for family members unable to travel. These are people who continue to deal every day with the threat of violence and war and have the least access to basic services and healthcare. This is a particularly vulnerable and immobile cohort, and reaching them with supportive care requires considerable and often risky outreach and mobile services. Overall, an estimated 18 million people in Ukraine are in need of humanitarian assistance today. So the health sector has been particularly impacted. Manufacturing capabilities and supply chains were badly disrupted. The movement of populations created a massive imbalance in demand for services, and the violence perpetrated against civilians, with over 22,000 civilian casualties reported to date, has created an unprecedented need for trauma supplies, care, and rehabilitation. Add to this the fact that demographically, this is the oldest population in humanitarian crisis in the world. Nearly a quarter of the population's country is over 60 years old. This means that access to care for chronic conditions, including access to dialysis, insulin, hypertension, and cancer treatments, has been and continues to be a defining feature of this crisis. WHO estimates that nearly 10 million people may have developed mental health conditions after being exposed to the horrors of fighting and hostilities, and an estimated 15 million Ukrainians in need of psychosocial support. This is compounded by the stress and demands of the health workforce, which from the outset of the war has been bravely enduring long hours, trying conditions, and continued threats of violence. When I visited a hospital in Zaporizhia last June, I was deeply impressed by the hospital director, who told me that the 3 months since the invasion, he had lost only 4 staff members to the West out of over 500. This was in spite of the unpredictability of the front lines and the heavy fighting around and nearby the nuclear power plant, if we all recall. It was a really precarious time. Today, however, health workers in the East and closest to the front lines are not provided with any additional incentives, which is making retention difficult when there are numerous safer options available to them in the West of the country. Attacks on healthcare workers have been unrelenting from the outset of the invasion. There have been recorded over 900 attacks on healthcare, which includes attacks on healthcare workers, patients, facilities, and supply chains. A multi-agency assessment recently carried out earlier this year found that 90% of healthcare facilities today are fully functional, but that medical equipment continues to be a concern, particularly in Eastern Oblasts, including in Donetsk, where 54% of facilities reported partial or total damage to their equipment. This report is referred to as the HERAMS report. It's excellent, very comprehensive. It's worth looking up, but should be noted that it does not include occupied territories. There's been no assessment done in those spaces. So in the early days of the war, the situation in Ukraine was chaotic. As my colleague who spent days on the road getting his wife and young children to Lviv described to me, he was part of an exodus of biblical proportions from east to west. Lines at the border were miles long, businesses and schools were closed, and no one knew just how quickly this Russian military could advance across the country. Today, the situation is much different. The front lines are well established, and there's a greater understanding of where the threats lie. And although we know that any area of Ukraine can become collateral in this war at any moment, there are nevertheless multiple realities in a country of this size. In the West, there is the relatively calm and functional Ukraine, where air raid sirens are less frequent and life feels strangely normal, or rather normal within this new reality. Populations of major urban areas in the West have more than doubled due to internal displacement, which creates competition for jobs, housing, and resources. But there's a sense of normalcy there that did not exist last year. The districts and oblasts in the north that were directly involved in the Russian advance on Kyiv last spring are still rebuilding and recovering from the heavy damage that was inflicted on the communities and the infrastructure. While some families have returned to these areas, many others no longer have inhabitable homes to return to. And then, of course, there's the Ukraine of the front lines in the south and east, where life is precarious and people are living without water, without health access, and without a sense of security and normalcy. Finally, there's the occupied Ukraine, which we don't see, for which there is no humanitarian access. However, we learned anything from the liberation of previously occupied territories during the counteroffensive last fall, like in Kherson in the south, or the villages and towns in Donetsk Oblast, we know that we have a lot to be concerned about for those who are living in that Ukraine. Little to no access to basic services, healthcare facilities totally looted and destroyed, and a desperate population that has been witness to and experienced the worst elements of this war. Of course, from the outset of this invasion, there's been a tremendous and resilient spirit of the Ukrainian people and large-scale grassroots mobilizations of volunteers to support the populations in need. The international aid community has also been very active in an evolving response over the past 14 months. Project Hope, along with numerous other NGOs and corporate partners, including many in this room, have been rehabilitating health facilities, supporting the medical supply chain, mobilizing medical teams to reach the most vulnerable communities, providing mental health and psychosocial support, distributing generators and supplies to help communities survive the winter, and conducting continuous and ongoing training for frontline healthcare workers. With the potential for the counteroffensive this spring, we are also preparing to mobilize supplies and personnel to reach newly liberated territories as soon as possible. Now, we've heard a few times already this week about the various government discussions that are going on and the quote unquote debates around the continued level of support for Ukraine. So I would just like to conclude here with an appeal to this group, this community of dedicated health and humanitarian actors, that we remain consolidated in our message and united in our ongoing support for the conflict affected populations of Ukraine. Thank you.